This discussion represents a little bit of a departure from what we've been talking about for the rest of the semester. We've primarily focused on the big differences between organisms. What makes a bird, or an insect, an insect? What are the morphological and then the underlying genetic and developmental mechanisms that cause those organisms to look so different? How do we lose features like eyes in a cave salamander or legs in this is actually a lizard. You might be forgiven for thinking it's a snake. So we've looked at those big major features, and we're going to hit a couple more big ones. We're not going to go into the details. You don't need to learn the genetics, and in some cases we don't really know the genetics, but we're going to learn a couple other big examples. And then we're going to move on and look to see what Evo Devo can tell us about variation within a species, about population diversity and how populations evolve and whether that's different. So that brings in this big picture idea of macroevolution versus microevolution. Now, this is really an artificial designation, but loosely based, macroevolution means the changes and differences that make species A different from species B, big things. Microevolution are the small, tiny changes that occur within a population. And so really, if you draw population boundaries, then you are drawing the boundary between what people call microevolution and macroevolution. But as we'll see, there really is no difference. It's all evolution, all change, just on a different scale with a different time frame. Now, it's very common across the animal kingdom for organisms to lose features that were once very adaptive. So let's think about why this might be so common. And in some ways, it's actually fairly natural, and we would expect it to happen. So when a feature evolves, even if it's a key innovation, and in some ways even especially if it's a key innovation, inevitably we will have some organisms that are faced with niches where it's no longer an advantage. And so the very thing that makes a group uber successful and very diverse makes them so that some of them are going to be exposed later on to a niche where that defining feature, that key innovation, is no longer a good thing. So ostriches have adapted to a large cursorial niche. Cursorial means running on two legs. And so wings are no longer needed. Now they still use them for balance and for display, but not for flight. So that main feature that made birds so successful is that function is lost. This is a grilloblattid, which is sometimes commonly called an ice crawler. It is evolved from a group of winged insects, but all grilloblattids are completely wingless. So this has happened many times in insects. Multiple lineages of insects have lost their wings. We see many organisms living in caves or other dark areas that lose their eyes. And again, this is a feature that was once a benefit, but mutations come up all the time that remove features or make them vestigial or non-functional. However, most of the time, that organism is not going to do well because it's carrying a mutation that is removing a critical feature. But in the right niche, those features may no longer provide the advantage. Okay? And so we're going to look at some major changes to body revisions, but I wanted to kind of get this idea out there. Right? So the conditions that lead to loss of an adaptive feature is just natural evolution in a diverse group of organisms. Eventually, there are going to be some that no longer need that original defining feature. And whether or not it happened once or multiple times, we would need to map it onto a phylogeny. That's the best way to do it. Now, sometimes it's rather obvious. So if I go into a cave and find a fish and a salamander that are both missing their eyes, and I know that salamanders have lots of eyed relatives, fish have lots of eyed relatives, it's obvious that that's not a single mutation that occurred in a lineage that led to the salamander and the fish. It's a convergent mutation due to their environment. But sometimes it's not immediately obvious. And so in those cases, we map the loss of those characteristics onto a well-supported phylogeny. And we have good data, good support for whether it happened a single time or multiple times. Now, here's an interesting one. We are going to look at a radical body change in the urochordates. This is the loss of a notochord. Now, the notochord is a defining feature of the chordates, and the urochordates are a little bit weird because they lost it in an adult phase, but it's still critical for them in early development. However, there are actually some species that have a vestigial or actually a complete lost notochord. So basically, they no longer have a tadpole form for their larvae. The larvae are just free-floating and just disperse wherever the current takes them rather than finding their own place. And in fact, some of these happened so recently that we can even make hybrids between the tailed forms and the non-tailed forms. So that's a dramatic, massive change, but in that case, dispersal works better. Most likely the reason is that you can make embryos that are slightly less, takes less energy to make each embryo, so you can make more embryos, and overall in that environment for this species, that was a beneficial trade-off. Okay? And so although we don't know for sure, almost certainly this is something dealing with brachyury. So by simply changing a regulatory element in this gene that initiates notochord development, in this one species of urochordate, we can turn it off. And it turns out that it's very, very easy to lose even a very complex structure if we have a mutation in the regulatory region or in the gene itself, but most commonly in the regulatory region of a very important early developmental gene, we can lose an entire structure. And we see that in humans, right? So there are often individuals who are born missing arms or missing other body parts. It's a very common mutation. And most of the time, those mutations are not going to be beneficial for the organism. But every once in a while, again, if they're exposed to the correct niche, they may have that. So it's very easy to lose features, particularly in very diverse groups with lots of different niches that they're exposed to. And so mutation in this single gene, or like I say, more likely its regulatory element, results in this dramatic morphological change. And if you put these two larvae next to each other and this guy next to all of the other urochordate species, this would look very, very different. So it's difficult to place it without its proper context and without some additional work, probably phylogeny, to determine exactly how this unusual individual fits in with the rest of the urochordates. Now, loss of legs is an incredibly common thing that happens across vertebrates, and it's been especially pronounced in the squamata. Now, squamata is the technical term for the group that includes both snakes and lizards. Now, it turns out that if you look at a phylogeny, that just like birds are just very highly adapted, successful dinosaurs, it turns out that snakes are actually just very highly adapted, successful lizards. They lost their legs, and they are related to Gila monsters and iguanas and monitor lizards. They're more closely related to those groups of lizards than they are to other lizards. So lizards, as we know it, is a paraphyletic group, not a valid classification. But it's been an incredible success for this one lineage of lizards that we call snakes. They've evolved the complete loss of legs in modern snakes, and it's been very, very successful. But we can see over and over again that happening. There are actually many lineages of lizards that have lost their legs. This is a glass lizard, which looks like a snake initially. The head looks like a lizard, and if you look, you can see external ears and other very clear lizard features. So it's clearly not a snake and more closely related to skinks and other types of lizards than it is to the snakes. And even outside of the squamata, we have some interesting examples. This is a amphisbaenid. Amphisbaenids are also squamata. They're part of this group, one of the smaller groups that you don't know as well. You know what? I take that back. I think it's Sicilian. I'm not a herpetologist. I'm going to double check. There actually is an amphibian example too, and I believe the amphisbaenid is the the Sicilian is the amphibian. I shouldn't have doubted myself. So the reptilian version is the amphisbaenid. There's a amphibian version that looks very, very similar. So loss of legs is common, and again, they've been exposed to the right niches. And we can look at this phylogenetically and determine exactly in what groups it occurred and how many times it happened. And again, in the squamata, it's happened probably a half a dozen or more times. And snakes are just the most successful of all of the lizards to have lost their legs. And in fact, we can even see some of the steps along the way if we look at the fossil record. So this is an artist's reconstruction of an extinct snake that had vestigial hind legs. And some of the other lizard groups are actually very interesting. I'll bring up another image here I'm going to show you, because we can see that there are groups that are on their way to becoming completely legless, but have not completely lost their legs. So leg loss. Let's look at skinks. So there are legless skinks that really have completely lost their legs. And then there are others that just have these little tiny vestigial legs. So let's see if I can find, I think this one's got vestigial front legs. And there's a diversity of features. So we see some of the steps. So there are his legs, his front legs right there. Those little tiny limbs that really aren't used for anything anymore. They're vestigial hind legs in this species are still useful. So we can kind of see evolution along the way. And maybe if we came back in 1,000 years, these vestigial forelimbs would no longer be around, and this might be much more snake-like, or they might just have hind limbs depending on the niche and the adaptations that are occurring there. Okay, and in fact, not only can we see them in fossil records and some with very, very reduced appendages, there are some snakes, the boa constrictors, that actually have these little spurs that are thought to be little vestigial remnants of the hind legs. The hind legs seem to hang around a little bit longer. They might provide some adaptation or be the last step in a trajectory towards losing all of your legs. So loss of legs is very common in the squamates, right? And so again, if we looked, some of this has been done, I don't know in the snakes, but we could probably target genes that initiate leg development and look at how those genes, or maybe more likely their regulatory elements, are different in the snakes, the legless lizards, and see whether this happened the exact same way or whether there were different mutations that led to the different losses of legs. And very likely there are going to be different mutations. There are lots and lots of ways to turn off a gene. We might have mutation to 5 or 6 or 7 different regulatory elements in a key gene, and you could have that one in one lineage, excuse me, and one in another lineage, and so we have a different mutation, and so we could see convergence in the exact fine details of the mutations also. Okay, so in the python, the hind limb in its position is initiated by the exact same boundary as in other organisms, HOX-C6 and HOX-C8. That's where the boundary for the hind limbs is, and it's still there, but pythons don't grow full legs, they just grow these little spurs. So they still have the mechanism for defining where the hind limbs are, but they never grow those hind limbs. Okay, so something is interfering with leg development, distalis, or maybe something upstream of distalis is mutated so that we don't grow those legs where their ancestors did. Okay, now, is it possible to re-evolve features? And as we start to think about it, we realize that this might be much more likely than we think. Remember, many of these genes are in complex networks, and so just because we turn off one connection of a network doesn't mean that network goes away. In fact, it might be maintained because those genes have many other functions. And so it's possible if we lose even a complex feature like a leg, if we just are severing one genetic connection, that many, many years down the road, you could potentially have a new mutation or a reverse of the original mutation that might bring back a feature that was lost. And so this is interesting here because when we look at fossil snakes, there's actually 2 of them that have well-developed legs, but they seem to have come from a group that already lost their legs. So there's some evidence from the fossil record and the phylogeny of these groups that legs in these individuals were re-evolved. But again, they weren't re-evolved from scratch. It was like a feature kind of in hiding with the network still intact that was then reactivated. And it was used to be thought that once a feature, especially a complex feature, was lost, there's no way you would get it back, just because it's insanely unlikely that it would evolve again with all the same changes and give you back the same feature. But when we understand the underlying genetic network, we realize that the integrity and long-term maintenance of these networks might make it so it's possible to bring back features that were once lost. Okay? Now, other groups of vertebrates have also lost their legs, but sometimes not all 4. So, for instance, cetaceans, the dolphins and the whales, have lost their hind limbs. Now, we know this from the fossil record. All their ancestors had hind limbs. It's only about the last 30 million years or so that we see species of whales without hind limbs. All whales, all dolphins today, as species, do not have hind limbs. However, every once in a while there is a rare mutant that grows these hind limbs, these little flippers that are right where the pelvis would be. And we can still see rudiments, vestigial elements internally of a whale's pelvis. So we already know that, and the ability to grow these hind limbs is still there. It's just turned off and occasionally reactivated. So what we know, you can explain and should be able to, on exam number 3, able to explain how we might re-evolve an entire structure like a limb, but not do it completely from scratch. Okay, so let's look at one other major vertebrate revision. This is turtles. Now, turtles are a remarkably well-adapted and distinct group of organisms. They're very, very different from any other group of organisms on Earth. They have a shell made up of a plastron, that's the bottom part, and a carapace. Both of the plastron and the carapace are actually modified ribs. Now, I don't know if you ever watched cartoons when you were a kid, but I have this very distinct memory of, I think it was a Looney Tune cartoon, and there was a turtle in it, and he had flipped over upside down and couldn't get flipped back over. And so he pops out of his shell, flips it back over, and then hops back in. Now, you realize, of course, that that's entirely impossible. The shells are actually part of their skeleton, and they are modified modified ribs, right? They still have their 4 limbs. But those modified ribs with extra growth factor to cause them to grow more anterior and posterior until they fuse together and make up the elements of that shell. And the ribs actually are expression growth factors that are normally expressed in the growth of appendages of the legs. And so they have co-opted this growth mechanism, not to grow a limb, but to grow an expanded rib. Okay? So shells of the turtle, a dramatic, remarkable renovation, and you should know that they are a co-option of limb patternings to grow extra anterior and posterior length on the ribs.